I'm Lauren Pierce, 38, and the whisper I catch outside my father's study stops me mid-step. A woman's voice, smooth as silk, measures the place I've called home for 5 years and murmurs, "The house alone could fetch at least 1.3. My coffee slips from my hand, the mug hits the hardwood, and the sound rings down the hallway like a bell made of china and panic. The door opens, and Celeste steps out, a careful smile settling on her face as if it's been practiced in a mirror. Behind her, the desk is spread with tidy stacks, property assessments, bank statements, a set of forms with empty signature lines waiting like open mouths. She calls me sweetheart, as if we've known each other longer than a season, and asks if I'm all right while her fingers gather papers with a dancer's economy. My father appears at her shoulder, uncertain, trusting, relieved to have someone besides me organizing the future. I look past them at the house my mother filled with quilts and framed photos and Sunday roasts, and I feel the chill of someone appraising it by the square foot. I say nothing, because sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps a person from breaking. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever stood guard over someone you love, hit that like and subscribe so we can stand watch together. I grew up in this house on a tree-lined street outside Sacramento, back when the air smelled like grass clippings, and my father's chalk dust, and my mother kept the good dishes for holidays that always ran late. We learned early to value kindness first, to keep promises, to show up even when it was inconvenient. After Mom passed, those lessons felt less like rules and more like rails that kept me upright. So when Dad started faltering and the grief came in waves, I left my little apartment in Santa Monica, packed my life into 2 suitcases, and drove north with the radio low and the windows cracked for air. I had managed a communications team I loved, the kind of job that puts a spring in your step when the elevator doors open, but I told myself it would be for a short season while we found our footing. I traded ocean views for a porch swing and a pill organizer divided by days of the week. Grant sent expensive flowers from Florida, and called on Sundays. Dana kept promising a visit between lectures and committee meetings, and I learned to speak the language of insurance-hold music without losing my temper. We found a rhythm morning, walk simple meals, framed photos dusted on Thursdays, a little dignity stitched back into the corners of each day until Celeste appeared at a dinner party 2 blocks over, all soft sweaters and careful listening, and the rhythm fell a beat behind where I could reach it. Celeste arrived in our lives the way ivy finds brick, quietly at first, and then everywhere, offering rides to appointments and slipping handwritten lists into my father's pocket so he'd feel prepared. She brought pastries from the downtown bakery and praised the neighborhood in a way that sounded like she was pricing it out loud. She was kind to my father in a way that made sense at the beginning. Gentle reminders, cheerful notes on the calendar, the soft confidence that calms a room, and I wanted to be grateful because everyone told me she was a blessing we hadn't expected. But I noticed how she would tilt a paper just out of my sight while explaining a plan how she would answer for him when the conversation turned to decisions, how my father's eyes drifted toward her for permission that used to come from his own good sense. I told myself it was new love and a man's pride in feeling wanted after a long winter of loss, and I told myself not to borrow trouble, yet the stacks on the desk grew higher, the phrases sharper: simplify, streamline, transition. When I asked simple questions, Celeste smiled with patient concern, the way a nurse distracts a child from a shot, and my father looked relieved that someone else had the script. We'd never had much money growing up, just enough, and never more. But it had been honest and steady, Dad's professor's salary, and Mom's knack for stretching $1 until it agreed to 1 more mile, 1 more month. The house was the splurge, the thing my mother loved, because it held us all without complaint. The first time I heard Celeste speak about it like a portfolio line instead of a home, something inside me flexed, not outrage exactly, but a familiar tightening, like when you sense a storm before the clouds show it. I started seeing the differences between the life I'd left and the life I was living. Friends sipping $9 lattes against a blue Pacific. My calendar, once packed with deadlines and client pitches, now replaced by grocery lists, pharmacy counters, and the tender work of coaxing an appetite from a man who had lost the taste for his own days. The contrast wasn't a complaint. It was just a split screen I carried around, proof that choices are real and have weight. So when I saw those transfer forms under Celeste's hand signature lines, waiting property lines labeled account numbers, highlighted, I felt the rails my mother taught me tighten at my sides. My father has always stood straight even when life bent around him, a man who loved a good map and read footnotes for pleasure, but grief loosens things you thought were bolted down. Lately he's been tired by early evening, and the last thing he needs is a chorus of decisions pressing for answers he's not ready to give. Celeste says words like future-proof and best care and ease the burden, and I hear what people mean when they want a problem handled without having to look it in the eye. I hear it in my brother's quick calls and my sister's gentle deflections, both of them good people who live far away and work very hard at the lives they chose, both of them eager for me to be less worried, less watchful, less here. I also hear it in my own breath at the end of a long day, a sigh I don't like admitting because it tells the truth this is heavy, and I get tired too. Still, the promise I made to my mother standing beside her hospital bed, her hand warm in mine, didn't sound like convenience when I spoke it. It sounded like my own voice saying yes to who I am. The night after I picked ceramic shards from the kitchen floor, I wiped the study desk clean and placed the papers into neat piles. The house felt too quiet, the air waiting for a footstep. Celeste had left a slim folder with a blue tab and a yellow sticky note that read, "Sign when ready," as if readiness were a checkbox and not a person's life. My father's favorite pen lay beside it, uncapped the ink, just beginning to dry at the tip. I capped it open the drawer to return it, and noticed a second set of forms tucked beneath a magazine, these ones heavier stock, the kind used when a signature changes the shape of a family. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the house breathe, the porch settling the clock on the mantel, ticking in my mother's soft rhythm. By the time I closed the drawer, I knew two things. I would not be rushed into someone else's definition of help, and I would need to see every line of every document before another pen touched paper. Later, as I checked the locks and turned off the last lamp, a small thought rose like a ripple across still water. If someone is pushing this hard to simplify, there is a reason they don't want the steps examined. Reasons I've learned tend to leave a trail for those willing to follow it. I set my phone on the nightstand and stared into the dark until my eyes adjusted to the shapes I knew by heart, my mother's quilt folded on the cedar chest, the framed photo of my father laughing in the backyard, the doorway cut with the faintest glow from the hall nightlight. Sleep didn't come quickly. Somewhere down the hall a drawer slid closed, and I told myself it was just the house settling. In the morning I'd start with the papers I'd seen and the questions I could ask without setting off alarms, because something in this story had shifted and the next page would tell me where to look first. The morning after I found those papers, I decided to start paying closer attention. I told myself it was just precaution, but in truth, I was already looking for something I didn't want to find. Celeste had a way of moving through the house that left no trace, but her perfume lingered just long enough to remind me she'd been there. That afternoon, while straightening the mail on the kitchen counter, her purse slid from the chair and tipped over. A small orange bottle rolled across the tile, tapping against my shoe. At first I thought it was one of Dad's supplements, but the label didn't match any I'd organized in his pillbox. The name on the bottle wasn't his, and the medication lorazepam was strong, far stronger than anything his doctor had ever prescribed. My chest tightened as I turned the bottle in my hand, reading the dosage twice to be sure. The sound of footsteps creaked overhead, and I slipped the bottle into my pocket before Celeste's heels reached the stairs. I called my friend Jenna that evening, sending her a photo of the label. She'd always been honest with me, even when I didn't want her to be. "That's a heavy sedative," she said after a pause. "In older patients, it can cause confusion, even mimic dementia if taken long enough." I stood in the pantry with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the shelves I'd stocked with Dad's favorite soups. Jenna's voice softened. "Lauren, this isn't harmless. If he's taking these without knowing, it's dangerous." I thanked her and hung up, staring at my reflection in the stainless steel toaster until it blurred. Every moment of Dad's foggy memory, every time he'd mixed up my name or forgotten what day it was, began to replay in my head. It wasn't age, it wasn't grief. Someone was doing this to him. That weekend, our family's weekly video call flashed across my laptop screen. Grant appeared first, perfectly pressed shirt even on a Sunday, and behind him the gleaming skyline of Miami. Dana joined a few seconds later, glasses low on her nose, as she shuffled a pile of student papers. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I found something, I said, holding up the photo of the pill bottle. Celeste's been giving Dad sedatives. He's not sick, she's drugging him. Grant sighed, leaning back in his chair. Lauren, not this again. Maybe they were prescribed. You're reading too much into it. His doctor never ordered this, I said. Jenna confirmed it. Dana barely looked up. Maybe you're overreacting. Celeste's a nurse, right? I felt the heat rise in my chest. She's not a nurse. She's his wife and she's manipulating him. Grant glanced at his watch. He seems fine when I talk to him. Forgetful, sure, but he's in his 70s. His tone was calm, the kind of calm that builds walls. You wanted him to have companionship. Now he does, and you're jealous. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Jealous. The word tasted bitter. You haven't seen him in a year. You have no idea what's happening here. But the call was already slipping away. Dana muttered something about grading deadlines. Grant mentioned a client waiting on him, and within seconds the screen went black. Behind me, I heard Dad's voice. "Who were you talking to, honey?" I turned to find him in the doorway, his expression confused. "Was that one of your friends?" My throat tightened. "That was Grant," I said softly. "Your son." He blinked, puzzled. "Grant?" He looked different. I managed a nod, forcing a small smile. He shaved his beard. Dad chuckled faintly, but the sound was hollow. When he wandered back toward his armchair, I sat at the table staring at the muted screen, realizing how far gone my family's faith in me had drifted. Over the next week, Celeste's intentions began to sharpen around the edges. Brochures for luxury memory care facilities appeared on the coffee table beside Dad's crossword book. She left them open to pages that showed wide porches and smiling attendants in crisp uniforms. He'd be safer somewhere with 24-hour staff, she told me one evening as I prepared dinner. It's so much for you to manage. She smiled kindly, but her eyes flicked toward the antique china cabinet my mother had treasured. And this place. So many valuables you must worry about damage. Her hand brushed the polished wood like she already owned it. That night, I logged into Dad's accounts, the ones I'd helped him manage since Mom died. 2 of them showed activity from an unfamiliar device. A third had a pending transfer I hadn't authorized. My pulse thudded in my ears as I printed the records, tucking them into a manila envelope. The next morning, I found Mom and Dad's wedding photo missing from the living room wall. After searching for half an hour, I discovered it wrapped in newspaper behind a box of Christmas ornaments in the garage. When I hung it back, Celeste appeared in the doorway, her tone airy. "Clutter confuses him," she said. "You'll see. Minimalism helps memory." Her hints turned bolder each day. "You'll need to start thinking about your own place soon," she told me over breakfast, stirring her coffee as if discussing the weather. "Richard and I need our privacy." My phone buzzed. Then Grant's name lighting the screen. His message was short. "Stop making waves. Dad's life is finally stable." I put the phone face down and stared at the tablecloth, the pattern of blue and white leaves fading where the fabric had thinned. That evening I sat on the porch swing as the sun sank behind the oak trees, the air thick with the scent of the roses my mother planted. The house glowed faintly through the windows, a shape both familiar and foreign. The sound of my phone broke the quiet. Lauren came the deep, steady voice I hadn't heard in months. "It's Walter. I got your message. Tell me everything." Uncle Walter didn't rush me. He never had. I told him about the pills, the transfers, the way Celeste had turned Dad's trust into a weapon. He listened without interruption, asking calm questions, dates, names, details. When I finished, there was a long pause. "I believe you," he said finally. "This sounds like elder abuse. I'll drive down from Oregon this weekend. We'll get to the bottom of it." After the call, I sat for a long time watching the first fireflies blink in the yard. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than dread, a small, steady flicker of relief. But underneath it, a question lingered. Should I confront Celeste and risk driving her to act faster, or gather more evidence quietly until I had proof no one could dismiss I didn't know which was safer for Dad? The next morning, I got my answer in the worst way. A call from Martin Wells, our family attorney, came just after breakfast. His tone was careful, the way someone speaks when they already know the news will hurt. "Lauren," he said, "I thought you should know your father signed some new documents yesterday." My fingers went cold. What documents? Power of attorney revocation, he said. Updated will asset transfers, all legally executed. For a moment, I couldn't speak. When did this happen? Celeste scheduled it Monday morning. Your father asked that you not be informed. The line buzzed quietly between us. I'm sorry, Lauren. My hands were tied. I ended the call and drove home through a fog that didn't lift even when I parked. 3 real estate agents' cars lined the driveway. Through the bay window, I could see Celeste leading them through the house, gesturing toward the staircase and the garden. My father sat in his chair bewildered while Grant, freshly arrived uninvited, stood beside him with a brochure in hand. The market's hot, I heard him say when I stepped inside. We could get a great price, Dad. It's too much house for you now. Dad looked confused. But this is our home. Your mother and I raised you here. Grant smiled tightly. Exactly, Dad. You deserve comfort now. Evelyn mentioned you fell last week. My stomach dropped. He didn't fall, I said, stepping into the room. Grant barely glanced my way. Stay out of this, Lauren. We're just discussing options. Celeste's eyes met mine for a brief moment, calm and unbothered. You'll understand soon, she said softly. That night I couldn't sleep. Every light in the house seemed to hum with the sound of something unraveling. Around midnight, I heard a faint clatter in the kitchen. I crept down the hallway and stopped just short of the doorway. Celeste stood at the counter transferring pills from one bottle to another. 2 for breakfast should keep him calm, she whispered to herself, twisting the cap shut. Maybe an extra in the afternoon. I backed away before she could notice me, my pulse echoing in my ears. Back in my room, I opened my journal and began writing everything I'd seen the labels, the time, the exact words she'd spoken. My handwriting trembled, but the act of writing steadied me. When the pen finally lifted from the page, the first light of dawn had already begun seeping through the blinds. I knew then that confrontation wasn't enough. Proof would be the only language anyone would believe. And as the sun rose over the quiet street, I promised myself I would gather at every signature, every pill, every whispered word, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. The days that followed blurred together in a strange rhythm of quiet dread. I moved through the house as if I were walking a tightrope, aware that one wrong step could draw Celeste's attention. She had a way of appearing without sound, like she'd been there all along. Every morning she handed Dad his coffee and a small glass of water with a pill, her voice sweet, her smile steady. I started pretending to busy myself at the sink so I could watch without being noticed. Once he swallowed, she always patted his shoulder and whispered something I couldn't hear. When she left the room, I took the mug to the counter, running my finger along the rim, half expecting to feel residue. There was never anything, only the faint scent of lemon polish she favored. That week, I found myself sleeping in fits. I kept a blanket on the hallway floor outside Dad's room, just close enough to hear if he stirred. The creaks of the house that used to comfort me now made my heart jump. Every soft click of a cabinet or distant drawer pulled me from half-dreams. When the exhaustion became too heavy, I wrote, page after page in a notebook I kept under my pillow, dates, times, details of each strange thing I saw. Celeste's late-night walks to the kitchen, the missing photograph from the wall, the unfamiliar cars in our driveway. Writing was the only thing that kept me from doubting myself. One morning when I tried to organize Dad's medications, he grew agitated. Celeste takes care of that now, he said, his tone sharper than I'd heard in months. I froze the pill bottles halfway between my hands and the table. He saw my face and softened. You do too much already, sweetheart. Let her help. I nodded, though my throat tightened. The words I wanted to say, she's hurting you, stayed trapped behind my teeth. I stepped outside, letting the cold air sting my skin. By the time I reached the hardware store, I'd made up my mind. That afternoon, while Celeste was at her standing hair appointment, I installed 3 small motion-activated cameras, one above the kitchen cabinet, another in the hallway by Dad's study, and one near the medicine drawer. I read every line of the manual, learning how to sync them to a private cloud account she couldn't reach. My hands shook as I mounted each one, but the trembling came more from adrenaline than fear. When she returned home, I was at the stove pretending to focus on dinner. She hummed as she unpacked her bag, completely unaware of the quiet lenses watching her. 2 days later, Dad had an appointment with Dr. Boone. I insisted on driving. Celeste came along chatting cheerfully, as though the tension between us didn't exist. When we arrived, she flipped through a magazine in the waiting room while Dr. Boone examined Dad. After a while, he asked her to step out so he could talk privately. "Whatever's happening," he told me quietly, "it isn't dementia. I've seen this pattern before. Over-medication sometimes deliberate." His voice dropped lower. "Your instincts are right, Lauren." He placed a reassuring hand on mine. "Keep notes. You might need them." That validation steadied something inside me I hadn't realized was slipping. For weeks I'd questioned whether I was imagining it all, whether grief had made me paranoid. On the drive home, Celeste filled the car with talk about new drapes and paint colors. Dad sat beside her, quiet and distant, watching the fields pass through the window. I kept my eyes on the road, my jaw tight. The next morning, when Celeste left for another salon visit, I brewed coffee and sat with Dad at the kitchen table. The light coming through the curtains was soft, the kind that made everything look gentler than it was. He stirred his coffee slowly, his hand steady. Without her, there he looked more like himself, his shoulders less slumped, his eyes clearer. After a moment, he glanced up at me. "Lauren," he said, "why are you still here? Don't you have your own life?" The question landed harder than he meant it to. I took a breath. "Because I promised Mom I'd take care of you," I said, "and something isn't right here." He looked at me, then really looked, and I saw a flicker of recognition, the sharp awareness I'd missed for months. "I've been having strange gaps in my memory," he said slowly. "Yesterday I couldn't remember your mother's name." His voice wavered. "How could I forget Eleanor?" I reached across the table and took his hand. "It's not you, Dad," I said quietly. He nodded, eyes wet. "Sometimes I feel better when Celeste isn't around to give me my pills. They make everything foggy. The word they hung in the air like a secret. Grant keeps saying we should sell the house," he added. "But this is your mother's home. I don't want to leave." His grip tightened. "Promise me we'll fight for it." I promised. 3 days later, Uncle Walter's old pickup pulled into the driveway. He looked tired from the 12-hour drive, but determined. He hugged me first, then Dad clapping his shoulder. "You look better than I expected," he said, half teasing. Dad smiled faintly. Walter spread his papers on the kitchen table and got right to business. "We're drawing up a new power of attorney," he explained. "Dual signatures, yours and mine, for any financial move. That'll slow her down." Watching him, I felt something I hadn't in months, solid ground beneath my feet. Celeste wasn't thrilled when she learned about it. Her smile thinned and she started avoiding Walter altogether. Meanwhile, Dr. Boone ran full cognitive tests confirming what we both already knew. "When properly medicated, your father shows no significant impairment," his report read, "no indication for memory care placement." I read those words twice, then slipped the report into a folder with the financial records I'd been saving. Proof was starting to stack up. By the time Walter and I took Dad to the credit union to secure the documents and his most important papers in a safety deposit box, I was no longer trembling when I spoke. The clerk handed us the receipt, and for the first time in weeks, I felt ahead instead of behind. That night, Walter and I reviewed the footage from the security cameras. On the screen, Celeste stood on the back patio with Grant. The timestamp showed early evening 2 nights before. Their voices carried clearly. "The perfect target," Grant said, pointing toward the house. "He'll never question it. We split the profits after the sale 60-40. Celeste's laugh was sharp. 70-30, she countered. "I'm doing the heavy lifting." Walter paused the video and looked at me. "That's all we need," he said. "But let's make sure it sticks." I spent that night planning. If I confronted them privately, they could twist it, call me unstable, play innocent, until the evidence vanished. But if the truth came out in front of others, people who knew my father, people who cared about him, they couldn't spin it. I needed witnesses' documentation and timing. I needed them to expose themselves. The idea came quietly as I watched Dad reading on the porch the next morning. His birthday was next week, his 72nd. Every year, Mom had thrown him a simple dinner with neighbors and colleagues, and the thought of canceling it again felt wrong. So I didn't. I expanded it instead. old friends Dr. Boone, the attorney, a few neighbors who'd known our family for decades, and of course Celeste and both my siblings. I would make it sound like a celebration, but it would be something else entirely. That evening at dinner, I smiled across the table and said casually, "I'm planning something special for Dad's birthday next Saturday. Just a small gathering, maybe 30 people. Grant and Dana are coming, and I've already invited Dr. Boone." Celeste's fork slipped from her hand, the sound sharp against her plate. I kept my voice light. "It'll mean a lot to him to see everyone together." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she forced a laugh. "Of course. He'll love that." When I cleared the dishes later, I saw her phone on the counter, the screen lighting up with a text from Grant. It read, "We need to talk before the party." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. Whatever they planned, they wouldn't be the only ones ready. That night before turning in, I checked the cameras one last time and watched the clips uploading to the cloud. Outside, the garden lights flickered softly, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The house felt still again, almost peaceful. I closed the laptop and whispered into the quiet, "Soon, Dad. Just a little longer. In a few days, the birthday would bring everyone under the same roof. And when it did, I'd finally have the chance to bring the truth into the light once and for all." The morning before Dad's birthday week began, the house felt strangely calm. The roses outside had bloomed overnight, the same pink ones my mother planted the summer I graduated college. I watched them from the kitchen window, trying to hold on to that sense of quiet before the next storm. Uncle Walter was already at the table, spreading papers neatly across the wood. "We've got the power of attorney filed," he said, tapping his pen. "Now it's just about keeping things steady until the right time." I nodded, grateful for his calm. Each step he guided me through, every signed form, every witness had become a small piece of armor. Over the next few days, I noticed how the air in the house shifted whenever Celeste entered the room. Her voice, always so measured, carried a slight tremor now, like someone who had started to realize the ground wasn't quite as firm beneath her feet. She began double-checking locks, keeping her phone close, and calling Grant more often than usual. Once I overheard her whisper, "She's planning something," before catching herself when she saw me. I smiled politely and went back to chopping vegetables, pretending I hadn't heard. Dr. Boone stopped by midweek for a checkup and found Dad sitting on the porch with the newspaper humming to himself. When I brought them both lemonade, the doctor gave me a discreet nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that Dad's clarity had returned. Inside, he spoke quietly. "Your father's medication levels are normal now," he said. "No sedatives in his system. He's sharper, stronger. Keep it that way." I promised I would. He handed me a copy of his medical report, his handwriting clear and deliberate. "This will matter later," he said, folding it into an envelope. That afternoon, Walter and I met at the credit union to move Dad's documents and valuables into a joint safety box. As we left, he pointed to the gray clouds building above the street. "Storm's coming," he said simply. He didn't mean the weather. By Friday, the plan for Dad's birthday was in motion. Invitations had gone out to 30 guests, old colleagues from the university, neighbors, and family friends who had known us since childhood. Celeste's expression the first time she heard the guest list told me everything she'd hoped for, something quiet, something she could control. Instead, she'd be surrounded by witnesses. I wanted her to feel confident enough not to run, but uneasy enough to make mistakes. That evening, while setting the table for dinner, I told her I'd already ordered the cake and catering. "It'll be good to celebrate," I said lightly, "after everything this year." She paused mid-motion, her silver bracelet glinting under the kitchen light. "Of course," she said, smiling. "Richard deserves it." But when she turned away, her hand trembled slightly as she poured her wine. Later that night, Walter reviewed the footage from the cameras again, making sure each clip had backed up properly. "Everything's there," he confirmed. The video of her and Grant on the patio, the late-night kitchen scenes with the pills. Every word captured, every timestamp clear. "We wait until the right moment," he said. "Let them show their cards first." Saturday arrived bright and deceptively peaceful. I woke early ironing Dad's favorite blue shirt and setting the dining room table with the good china Mom had insisted we keep for real occasions. The house filled slowly with voices and laughter, the kind of sound we hadn't heard in months. Dad stood near the doorway, greeting each guest with warmth that made my throat tighten. His posture was straighter, his eyes brighter. When Dr. Boone arrived, Dad clapped him on the back like an old friend asking about his grandchildren by name. By mid-afternoon, the house was alive. Music drifted from the speakers, and the air smelled of roasted chicken and lemon cake. I moved between the kitchen and dining room, checking every detail. Walter stood quietly near the archway, keeping an eye on the door. Around 4, Grant arrived 40 minutes late and smiling too broadly. Behind him walked a tall man carrying a leather portfolio. "Lauren," Grant said cheerfully, "this is Carter Voss, Dad's real estate advisor." My stomach tightened. "Advisor," I repeated. "For what property?" Before I could finish, Celeste appeared beside Dad, her hand curling around his arm. "We'll discuss that later," she said sweetly. "After the cake." I forced a nod, pretending to agree. The chatter around us muffled, but I could feel Walter's gaze steady on me from across the room. The time was drawing close. Dinner began at 6. The table stretched full with old friends and neighbors, the candles flickering between wine glasses. Dad sat at the head, a gentle smile on his face. He looked more like the man he'd been before. Grief hollowed him out. Just as the last of the dessert plates were cleared, Grant rose from his chair and tapped his glass. "If I could have everyone's attention," he began, voice smooth. "I have an announcement on behalf of our family." The room quieted. Celeste sat beside him, eyes glinting in the candlelight. "Dad has decided to simplify his life," Grant continued. "He's granted me authority to manage his affairs, and we'll be selling the house next month." The air seemed to leave the room all at once. I saw confusion flash across Dad's face, then fade under Celeste's reassuring touch. "It's what's best," she said softly, turning to the guests. "He'll be moving into Oak Ridge Village, beautiful place full of light." Before I could speak, Walter stood his chair scraping against the floor. "That's interesting," he said calmly, reaching into his jacket. "Because Richard and I filed new legal documents last week." He opened a folder and placed it on the table. "Dual power of attorney. Both our signatures required for any financial decision. Anything else is void." The guests murmured. Celeste's smile faltered just for a second. Dr. Boone rose next, pulling papers from his briefcase. "And as Richard's physician," he said firmly, "I can confirm his cognitive health is excellent when properly medicated. No sign of impairment or dementia. He's perfectly capable of making his own choices." I caught Carter Voss's uneasy glance as he started packing his portfolio. I felt my heartbeat steady. The time had come. I picked up the small remote from my lap and pressed play. The television mounted on the wall flickered to life. The footage filled the room, Celeste in the kitchen at midnight, transferring pills between bottles, her movements methodical. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Those are supplements," she said quickly, her voice higher than usual, "for his memory." Dr. Boone stepped closer. "Diazepam isn't a supplement," he said quietly. "It's a sedative." Then the next clip began. Grant and Celeste on the patio, their voices clear. "He'll never question it," Grant was saying. "We split the profits after the sale." The silence that followed was heavy. Dana, who had arrived just before dinner, stood frozen. "Grant," she whispered, "is that real?" Her brother didn't answer. She picked up his phone from the table and scrolled. "These are the same words from your messages," she said, voice trembling. Celeste's hand clutched the tablecloth knuckles white. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply. "We were planning for his care, nothing more." Her eyes darted to Dad, searching for sympathy, but what she found instead was clarity. For the first time in months, he looked at her without fog or hesitation. Dad stood slowly, his hand resting on the table for balance. The chatter around us quieted. "You drugged me," he said, voice steady but low. "You took advantage of my grief." He reached into his pocket and removed the gold band she'd insisted he wear after their courthouse ceremony. "Our marriage was built on lies. Take it." The ring hit the table with a faint sound sharp enough to pierce the quiet. Celeste's mask finally broke, her calm replaced by something raw. "You think you can humiliate me?" she hissed. "You'll regret this." But the words came out thinner than her usual poise, and everyone in that room could hear the fear underneath. Walter moved closer to Dad. "You won't threaten him again," he said simply. Carter Voss backed toward the door, shaking his head. "I want no part in this," he muttered before slipping out. The party guests, once stunned, now whispered among themselves, piecing together what they'd witnessed. Grant looked toward the door too, but Dad blocked his path. "You were willing to sell your mother's home," he said quietly. "For what, your share?" Grant's voice cracked. "It wasn't like that." Walter's phone buzzed in his hand. "The authorities are on their way," he said, not looking up. Celeste's breath came faster, her composure unraveling completely. "I wasted months pretending to care for this family," she shouted. "All for nothing." The room fell silent again, the kind that leaves only the sound of your heartbeat. When the officers arrived minutes later, she didn't resist. They guided her out through the front door while neighbors whispered near the porch. The flashing lights reflected in the window panes, washing the room in alternating bands of red and blue. After they left, the house fell still. The candles burned low, the air thick with everything that had just happened. Dad sat slowly back into his chair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of it all. "What happens to us now?" he asked quietly, looking at me. I took his hand. "We start over," I said. Outside, the storm Walter had predicted had finally broken, rain tapping against the glass. And though the night was heavy with what we'd just witnessed, I could feel something clearing too, a small space opening where truth could finally breathe again. In the days ahead, we'd have to face the consequences, the investigations, the repairs. But for the first time in a long time, I knew we'd face them as a family, one that had been tested and was still standing. The police cars pulled away just after midnight, their lights fading into the rain-soaked street. Inside, the house had gone quiet. Only the tick of the hallway clock filled the silence. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the last guests leave in uneasy clusters. The once bright birthday decorations hung limp, the air thick with the scent of coffee and candle wax. Walter gathered the scattered papers from the dining table while Dr. Boone folded his medical report back into his case. Dad sat in his chair, shoulders heavy, staring at the untouched slice of cake still waiting in front of him. When the door finally closed, I turned off the music that had been looping softly in the background. The sudden stillness made the house feel bigger than it had in years. "You should rest," I said quietly, touching Dad's shoulder. "We can handle things in the morning." He nodded, eyes fixed on nothing. Walter helped him up the stairs, his hand steady at Dad's elbow. I stayed behind, clearing plates that had gone cold. Each clink of porcelain against the sink echoed through the empty rooms. By the time I finished cleaning, it was close to 2. The rain had eased into a drizzle, tapping gently against the kitchen windows. I stood for a moment and let the sound wash over me. The storm outside felt lighter than the one that had just passed through our lives. Upstairs, I could hear Walter's deep voice in low conversation with Dad, the words indistinct, but calm. When the house finally settled, I sank onto the couch, exhaustion pressing at every part of me. Yet even through the fatigue, I felt something I hadn't in months: relief. Morning came slow and gray. The smell of coffee drifted down the hallway. Walter was already in the kitchen reading the paper when I walked in. "They've taken her in for questioning," he said without looking up. "Grant's been contacted too. There'll be a hearing." I poured coffee and sat opposite him. "Do we know how long she'll be held?" He shook his head. "That's up to the investigators now. What matters is your father's safe." Dad came down a little later, dressed but quiet, the deep lines around his eyes more visible in the daylight. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find it all was a bad dream," he said. I met his gaze. "You're awake, Dad. It's over now." He managed a faint smile, though his hands trembled when he reached for his cup. "Then we move forward," he said softly. The following days moved in careful steps. Officers came by to take statements. Martin Wells stopped in to review documents for the case. Dr. Boone forwarded his full medical assessment confirming the traces of sedatives in Dad's blood work. Every piece of evidence added weight to what had once felt like guesswork. Grant avoided us for a while, answering only through his attorney, but Dana called almost every night, her voice breaking with apologies. "I should have listened," she said again and again. "I just didn't want to believe it." I told her the truth, that I hadn't wanted to believe it either. One afternoon, I found Dad in the garden, trimming the rose bushes. The sunlight caught the silver in his hair. "Your mother loved these," he said, pausing to brush a petal from his sleeve. "I almost let someone take this house from her memory." I handed him the pruning shears. "You didn't, though. You're still here." He smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it reached his eyes. A week later, Celeste was formally charged with elder abuse and financial fraud. The prosecutor's office requested full cooperation from our family. Walter handled most of the communication, shielding Dad from the noise of the process. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, but most people offered quiet support instead of gossip. Peter Lawson stopped by with groceries and simply said, "Your mom would have been proud, kid." It was enough. Grant finally showed up 2 days before the preliminary hearing. He stood in the doorway, looking smaller than I remembered. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said, his voice low. "I thought she cared about him." Walter didn't answer, only folded his arms and waited. I spoke instead. "You signed off on transfers. You stood in this room and helped her lie." Grant ran a hand over his face. "I know. I'll make it right." But I could see from his eyes that he wasn't sure how. That night, Dad asked to sit in the living room where Mom's piano still stood. He hadn't played since she passed, but he lifted the lid and let his fingers rest on the keys. The first notes were uneven, hesitant. Then the melody smoothed into something familiar, a song she used to hum while cooking Sunday dinners. I stood in the doorway, letting the sound fill the house. Walter joined me after a while, arms crossed loosely. "That's a good sign," he said. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. When the hearing came, we arrived early. The courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. Celeste sat at the defense table, her hair pulled back, her eyes avoiding ours. Grant was called to testify about the financial documents, his voice trembling as he read each date aloud. Dr. Boone presented his report explaining how the medication had impaired Dad's judgment. I watched the expressions shift across the judge's face, a mix of disbelief and controlled anger. By the end of the session, Celeste's attorney requested a plea discussion. Outside, the air was cool, the kind that hints at early spring. Dad stood beside me on the courthouse steps, his hand resting on my arm. "It's strange," he said quietly. "You spend your life teaching history and you forget you're still living it." Walter chuckled softly. "You've got a new chapter now, Rick. Maybe make this one lighter." We spent the next few weeks rebuilding small routines. I returned to remote consulting for my marketing firm, working from the dining table while Dad handled his own appointments again. Walter moved into a small condo 20 minutes away, but visited most evenings for dinner. Dr. Boone checked in weekly until Dad's blood work cleared entirely. Slowly, the tension that had filled the house began to lift. Dana came for a long weekend that May. She stood in the living room looking around like she was seeing it for the first time. "It feels different in here," she said. "Peaceful." Dad smiled. "That's the plan." He poured her coffee and they talked for hours about the past, about forgiveness, about starting over. I didn't interrupt. Some conversations need their own quiet to find their way. One evening, while cleaning out the hall closet, I found the old photo album Mom used to keep filled with faded Polaroids postcards and pressed flowers from trips long ago. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it beside Dad. He traced one photo with his finger, smiling at the image of my mother laughing in a wide-brimmed hat. "She would have handled this better than I did," he said. I shook my head. "You handled it the only way you could. And you're still here." By the time summer settled in, the house felt alive again. The smell of fresh paint replaced the scent of polish and medicine. Mrs. Delaney began coming 3 days a week to help with light chores, giving me time to focus on work. The porch swing creaked in its old familiar rhythm. Some nights, I'd find Dad out there humming softly, the sound carrying into the yard. We never spoke much about Celeste after that. The case would take its course, but we'd already done the hardest part, facing what we didn't want to see and speaking the truth out loud. What remained now was slower work, trust healing, and learning how to live without watching every shadow. As August approached, Dad mentioned wanting to travel. "Sedona," he said one morning, pointing to a brochure he'd saved. "Your mother always wanted to see those red rocks." I smiled. "Then we'll go." He folded the paper carefully and placed it on the counter, a small promise waiting for its moment. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked through the quiet house. The lights were low, the rooms calm. I paused by the study door, the same one where everything had first begun. The papers were gone, the drawers neatly closed. I turned off the lamp and let the darkness settle. Somewhere outside, a nightbird called. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel heavy. It simply felt like home again. And as I stood there listening to the stillness, I realized the fight we'd been through hadn't just been about saving a house. It had been about saving the people still living inside it. The air in the courthouse felt heavy that morning, the kind of weight that settles before something final. I walked beside Dad, his arm looped through mine, our steps slow but steady. Walter led the way toward the elevator, the faint squeak of his shoes echoing against the marble floor. Dana had flown in the night before and now followed quietly behind us, clutching her bag against her chest. It had been 3 months since Celeste's arrest, and today the court would hear her plea. When we entered the courtroom, the lights seemed too bright, the benches too polished. Celeste sat at the defense table dressed in pale gray, her hair pinned back in the same precise style she'd always worn. She didn't look at us, not even once. Grant sat on the opposite side, shoulders hunched, waiting to be called again as a witness. I hadn't seen him since the preliminary hearing. He glanced up briefly when we walked in, guilt flickering across his face before he looked away. Judge Cole entered and the room rose in unison. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had seen too much of this kind of thing before. The proceedings began quietly. Statements read evidence acknowledged. When the prosecutor described how Celeste had used controlled medication to keep my father disoriented while pushing through fraudulent transfers, I felt Dad's hand tighten around mine. Walter sat still beside us, his jaw locked. Celeste's attorney stood speaking in soft, practiced tones about misguided caregiving and emotional strain. He painted her as overwhelmed, not malicious. I could almost hear the subtle rhythm of persuasion he used on juries, the same tone Celeste had once used at our dinner table. But then Judge Cole interrupted. "Mrs. Hart," she said evenly, "you administered sedatives without a prescription, falsified financial documents, and attempted to sell property belonging to another person. Overwhelmed or not, that is criminal conduct." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. When the judge offered Celeste the chance to speak, she rose slowly, eyes down. Her voice trembled as she said she'd only wanted to help and never meant harm. But when she glanced toward our side of the room, her gaze met mine for the first time. What I saw there wasn't apology, it was resentment. The same cold calculation that had haunted our home in those months before everything fell apart. By noon, the plea was entered guilty to 2 counts of fraud, 1 of elder abuse. The sentence would come later, but the acknowledgement itself carried a strange finality. The gavel struck once, sharp and clear, and the noise echoed down the hall long after everyone began to file out. Outside the courthouse, sunlight broke through the clouds. Reporters lingered near the steps, but Walter shielded Dad as we made our way to the car. "It's done," he said quietly once the doors closed. "She can't hurt him again." Dad leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, his breath shaking on the exhale. "Then maybe," he said, "I can start living again." That evening the house felt different, lighter somehow, even though nothing visible had changed. Dana helped me make dinner while Walter sorted through mail in the living room. Dad moved slowly but insisted on setting the table himself. When the food was ready, we sat together. No formal toasts, no speeches, just quiet gratitude in the clinking of forks and plates. After dinner, Dad surprised us by pulling an old scrapbook from the shelf. He flipped through pages filled with yellowed photographs and brittle ticket stubs. "Your mother kept everything," he said, smiling softly. "She'd be laughing at us right now for letting this place fall into such chaos." Dana reached across the table, touching his hand. "Then maybe it's time we start fresh." In the weeks that followed, the process of rebuilding took shape in small, steady ways. I started rearranging the downstairs rooms, moving the heavy furniture out to let in more light. Mrs. Delaney came by twice a week to help with laundry and errands, freeing me to take on more clients from home. Dad began attending a veterans coffee group at the community center, something he hadn't done since Mom's passing. Every day his confidence seemed to return a little more. Grant called once late on a Sunday afternoon. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but answered on the third ring. His voice was hesitant. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, "for all of it." I didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added, "but I'd like to see Dad if he'll have me." After a long pause, I said, "He'll decide that for himself." When I told Dad about the call, he thought for a long moment. "He's still my son," he said quietly, "but trust isn't something you rebuild overnight." The following week, Grant drove up from Miami and arrived at the house carrying a box of old family photos. The visit was careful awkward at first. He and Dad sat on the porch talking about childhood memories work, and finally about what had happened. The conversation stretched for hours, broken only by the sound of crickets in the yard. When they finally stood, Dad offered a handshake instead of a hug. It was a start. Dr. Boone visited later that month for a routine checkup. "You're doing well, Rick," he said, jotting notes on his clipboard. "Keep this up and you'll outlive us all." Dad laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in so long that it startled me. After the appointment, the doctor lingered in the doorway, glancing back toward me. "You've done good work, Lauren," he said. "Don't forget to live your life again, too." I took his advice to heart. With Mrs. Delaney's help, I began spending more time on my marketing projects, reconnecting with old colleagues, and even traveling for a short weekend conference in San Diego, the first time I'd left home in over 5 years. When I returned, the house was just as I'd left it. Dad greeted me with a grin and said, "See? The world didn't end." Autumn rolled in quietly, bringing crisp air and the smell of fallen leaves. One evening, Dad suggested we visit Mom's grave together. We brought her favorite flowers, white lilies, and stood there for a long while. "She'd be proud of you," he said, voice low. "You kept your promise." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The next day, the letter from the court arrived. Celeste had been sentenced 18 months with restitution and a ban from acting as caretaker for anyone over 65. I placed the envelope on the mantel beside Mom's photo, a quiet acknowledgement that the circle had closed. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars appear one by one, Walter joined me, handing over a mug of tea. "You know, he said you could have walked away months ago. Most people would have." I looked out toward the dark yard where the roses caught faint silver light. Maybe I said, "But then she would have won." He nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "You did right by your family. Now do right by yourself." Inside, Dad's laughter drifted from the living room, where Dana and Grant had joined him for a card game. The sound carried through the open window, warm and familiar. For the first time in years, it felt like the house belonged to us again, not to grief, not to fear, but to the people still here. I sat back and listened, the cool night air brushing against my skin. We weren't finished healing, not yet. But the hardest part, the silence, the doubt, the fight to be believed, was behind us. What remained was life unfolding one quiet evening at a time. And as I looked toward the light spilling from the windows, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. No secrets, no shadows, just the kind of peace that's earned after everything has been taken and finally restored. The weeks following Celeste's sentencing carried a strange quiet, the kind that settles after a long storm. The house finally belonged to us again. No whispers, no tension hiding behind closed doors. Dad began sleeping through the night for the first time in months, and I could feel the rhythm of ordinary life slowly finding its way back. In late October, Lydia Monroe from the Sacramento Gazette called to request an interview about elder abuse prevention. I hesitated at first, but Dad encouraged it. "If telling our story keeps one family from going through this," he said, "then it's worth it." So one Friday morning, she arrived with a notepad and a gentle voice that filled the kitchen with an easy calm. She spoke mostly with Dad, asking about his recovery, his plans, his hopes. When she turned to me, her question was simple. "What made you keep pushing when everyone told you it was nothing?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Because I promised my mother I'd take care of him. And I knew what love should look like. It didn't look like that." The article published the following week. It was compassionate, factual, and written with quiet strength. Neighbors dropped off baked goods. Strangers mailed handwritten notes thanking us for speaking out. The attention was humbling, but it also brought closure. The fear that had once defined our days was now replaced by something steady: respect, understanding, even gratitude. Around Thanksgiving, Dana announced she was applying for a visiting professorship at Sacramento State. "It's just a semester," she said, though I could see she was already picturing something longer. Grant began calling more often, too, sharing updates about therapy sessions and community service tied to his plea deal. He didn't make excuses anymore. He simply showed up. One evening, Dad handed me his phone after one of their calls. "He wants to come for Christmas," he said. I nodded, surprised at how natural it felt to say yes. The night before Christmas Eve, I found Dad sitting at the piano. The lamp cast a warm glow across his shoulders as he played softly, slow, simple chords that lingered in the air. He stopped when he noticed me in the doorway. "Your mother used to hum this one," he said, fingers still resting on the keys. I think it helped her think. I sat beside him on the bench. "It still does," I said. We played together for a while, just enough to fill the quiet with something that felt like memory and healing woven together. When Grant arrived the next afternoon, the reunion was cautious but genuine. He came bearing gifts for everyone, small, thoughtful things that showed he'd been listening again. Walter greeted him with a firm handshake that lingered an extra second, the kind that said the door wasn't closed, but it would take time to walk through. Dinner that night was the kind of evening our family hadn't shared in years. No pretense, no distance, just laughter between bites and stories that stretched into the late hours. During dessert, Dad stood and raised his glass of cider. "To family that stands the test," he said, pausing as his eyes swept the table. "Not the easy test, the real one." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Dana smiled, and Grant reached across to clink his glass gently against mine. By New Year's, the house had taken on new energy. Walter started joining us for weekly dinners, often bringing his friend Evelyn, a retired school teacher, who shared his sharp humor and patient eyes. Mrs. Delaney continued helping part-time, but Dad insisted on handling most things himself now. "I need to stay capable," he said, half joking, as he wrestled with the snowblower out front. Watching him that morning, cheeks flushed from the cold, I realized just how far we'd come from the fragile days of medication fog and quiet fear. In February, Lydia Monroe reached out again. The state's Department of Aging wanted to feature Dad's story in a public education campaign about financial exploitation. This time, I accompanied him to the studio, where they filmed him sitting in his favorite armchair, sunlight streaming behind him. I thought I'd lost everything he said to the camera, but what I had, my daughter's trust, my brother's loyalty, turned out to be more than enough to save me. When the segment aired, calls poured in from families seeking advice or simply offering thanks. It wasn't fame, it was purpose, and it gave Dad a sense of usefulness again. By spring, the rose garden had bloomed early. The pink blossoms filled the yard with the same scent that used to drift through the kitchen when Mom was alive. One afternoon, as I pruned the stems, Dad came outside with 2 cups of lemonade. "You know," he said, handing one to me, "your mother used to joke that these roses were stubborn. They'd bloom even when you forgot to water them." I smiled. "Guess they take after you?" He laughed, that full, genuine laugh I hadn't heard in so long. The following week, we met with Martin Wells to finalize some estate updates. Dad wanted to ensure the house would remain in the family. "I'm not planning on going anywhere," he said, "but it's better to be prepared." Martin smiled. "This time you'll be the one making the choices, Richard." Dad signed the papers with a steady hand, then turned to me. "Feels good to know it's settled." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Grant joined me on the porch. He looked out at the yard where the roses caught the last light. "I'm going back to therapy full-time," he said quietly, "trying to make things right with myself before I can with anyone else." I nodded, and for once, the silence between us wasn't awkward. It was understanding. "You're doing the work," I said. "That counts." Inside, Dana was cooking with Walter and humming to the radio. Dad sat at the table reading a book, his glasses slipping down his nose. The smell of roasted vegetables and rosemary drifted through the air. Everything about that evening felt ordinary, and somehow that made it extraordinary. As I washed dishes later, Dad came up behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've been carrying this house for a long time," he said. "Maybe it's time you start thinking about what's next for you." I looked at him, unsure how to answer. "You mean moving out?" He smiled faintly. No, I mean moving forward. That night, lying in bed, I thought about his words. For years, my life had revolved around protecting him, rebuilding what others had tried to tear apart. Now that peace had finally settled in, I wasn't sure what to do with it. But I knew one thing for certain: I had the strength to figure it out. The next morning, I made a call to my old boss at Coastal Connections Marketing, the firm I'd left behind in San Diego. We talked for nearly an hour. When the conversation ended, I sat in the quiet kitchen, heart racing, a smile slowly forming. It wasn't a full return, but they wanted me to consult remotely on a national campaign, steady work, flexible hours, and a chance to do something I loved again. When I told Dad over breakfast, he grinned wide. "That's my girl," he said. "Your mother would have been proud." I reached for his hand. "I hope so." Outside, the sun filtered through the kitchen window, lighting the rose garden in soft pinks and golds. For the first time in years, the future didn't look uncertain. It looked wide open. And as I sipped my coffee, listening to the sound of the wind brushing through the trees, I realized the fight for justice had given us something far greater than peace. It had given us a second chance to truly live. But as life began to stretch forward again, one quiet question lingered at the edge of my thoughts: whether forgiveness for my brother would ever feel as natural as breathing. That answer, I knew, was still waiting just beyond the next horizon. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, soft and golden, the kind that wakes the roses before anyone's ready. From my bedroom window, I could see Dad already out in the yard trimming branches in his old straw hat. He waved when he noticed me watching, and for a moment it struck me how steady his movements had become, confident, sure, alive. It had been nearly a year since the hearing. The days had stretched out quietly, filled with ordinary moments that once felt impossible. Coffee in the mornings, laughter from the porch, Sunday dinners without tension. Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly like sunlight after a storm. Dad's strength returned in full by summer. He joined the local history society again and began teaching small workshops at the library on weekends. He'd come home with that same spark I remembered from my childhood when he'd lecture about American landmarks or Civil War letters. One evening after dinner, he smiled across the table and said, "You know, I thought I'd lost myself for good. Turns out I was just waiting for the right people to remind me who I was." Walter became more like a fixture than a visitor. His friend Evelyn fit seamlessly into our circle, her laughter often echoing through the kitchen as she and Dad debated old movies. Dana's visiting professorship turned permanent, and she rented a small place 10 minutes away. She'd stop by after class barefoot and distracted, carrying a tote full of papers and stories about her students. It felt like family again, not the kind defined by perfection, but the kind that survives the hard years and still shows up for dinner. Grant came around more slowly. His visits started short, then lingered longer each time. One afternoon, he helped Dad repair a loose shutter, both of them working quietly until the job was done. I watched from the porch, unsure when the tension between them had eased, only certain that it finally had. Later that evening, as the light faded, Grant sat beside me on the steps. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think admitting guilt would ruin me, but it's the first thing that made me feel human again." Dad forgave him in his own quiet way. No speeches, no dramatics, just small gestures that said everything: an invitation to Sunday dinner, a shared pot of coffee, a story retold without bitterness. Forgiveness. I learned doesn't erase what happened. It simply gives the heart room to breathe again. By autumn, my consulting work had grown enough to fill most of my days. Coastal Connections asked if I'd lead a long-term remote team from Sacramento, and I said yes. The hours were flexible, the projects meaningful. For the first time in years, I felt both useful and free. Dad teased that I'd finally become the boss of something that isn't this house. I laughed, but he wasn't wrong. The most unexpected part came later that winter. Lydia Monroe's article about Dad's recovery was nominated for a regional journalism award, and the local council asked if we'd attend the ceremony. I wasn't sure he'd agree, but to my surprise, he said, "If telling the truth once helped, maybe it can help again." When they called Lydia's name that night, the room filled with applause. She stepped up to the podium and said, Stories like the Pierces remind us that justice isn't just a courtroom outcome, it's what happens when ordinary people refuse to give up on each other. I looked at Dad and he smiled through tears he didn't try to hide. After the ceremony, we drove home in silence, the city lights fading behind us. When we pulled into the driveway, Dad rested his hand on my arm. "You kept your promise to your mother," he said, "but you've also kept one to yourself, even if you didn't know it." I asked what he meant. He looked toward the rose garden and said, "You didn't just save this family, Lauren. You rebuilt it." That night I stood by the window watching the moonlight touch the roses, their petals glowing pale against the dark. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt alive with voices, laughter, and all the love that had survived what tried to destroy it. In time, even the word justice changed meaning for me. It wasn't the trial, the sentence, or the papers signed in court. It was the slow return of peace, the kind you feel in a home that's finally safe again, in a father's steady voice, in the laughter of siblings learning to trust each other once more. Sometimes I think about what Mom would say if she could see us now. I imagine her standing in the garden, hands in the soil, smiling at how the roses have outlasted everything. Maybe she'd say that justice isn't about revenge, it's about restoration. It's the quiet work of love after the shouting ends. So here we are, still standing, still growing. The scars are there, but they've become part of the story, not the ending of it. I've learned that healing doesn't come from forgetting what broke you. It comes from honoring what survived. If you've ever had to start over after betrayal or loss, I hope our story reminds you that peace can return and love can take root again, even in the hardest ground. Thank you for listening. And if this story found its way to you at just the right time, take a moment to share it with someone who might need that same reminder tonight.